Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Rethinking PTSD Podcast. I'm very excited to finally be launching all of this. In this episode, I'm going to be telling you guys kind of my story. I'm also going to be explaining why I call myself, or why I started calling myself a psychedelic detective and what that is. But first, I want to talk just a little bit about what I'm trying to do with this YouTube channel, with the website, and with the subreddit, Rethinking PTSD subreddit. So the more that I've worked on myself and the more that I've looked at how trauma affects people, the more that it's become blatantly obvious to me that there are certain fundamental misconceptions that we have about trauma as a society. One is, the first one I would say is that it's like a character deficit, or it's a character flaw, or it's a sign of weakness for someone to experience the symptoms of trauma, and that's simply not true. I think that belief is starting to change, or has started to change, but that was fundamentally how our society has looked at trauma historically. In fact, up until 1980, there was no diagnosis for trauma at all, until the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis was first published in the DSM-3 in 1980. That was the first time that we had an actual diagnosis for trauma. There was one prior to that in 1956, but it was limited to the first 6 months after the event. And then after that, it had to be categorized as something else. And so my conclusion, and I really firmly believe this, is that every single person has a point at which they would experience all of the symptoms of PTSD. Now, you might have to pile up like a lot of really awful trauma onto a person for them to get to that point, but everyone has a point at which they would experience all the symptoms of PTSD. These are normal reactions to trauma, and so we need to start recognizing that, because otherwise we're basically telling people that it's their problem, they're just too weak, and so then people end up just basically denying that they even have problems. And if you can't acknowledge that you have problems, then you're never going to fix them. The second thing that I wanted to talk about, shift that I think we need to make, is that in some cases, trauma and the effects of trauma don't really show up as like stress. Like, you might have an overactive nervous system. You might have a sympathetic nervous system that's being triggered too frequently and too easily. But that fight or flight response is also sometimes called the fight, flight, or freeze response, because if you can't fight and you can't flight, then you freeze. And so your body goes into like a shutting down kind of mode. And then there's also a condition called alexithymia, which is emotional numbness. And also it's the inability to feel sensations in your body. And so you end up just numbing out completely within your body. And so somebody like myself that was experiencing alexithymia and an overactive nervous system, it was hard for me to actually identify that that's what was going on, because I couldn't feel anything in my body. And I also didn't know until I started to get my emotions back that emotions were something that you were supposed to feel in your body. And so if you take someone that is experiencing those kinds of symptoms, and then the other thing is that depression is one of the primary symptoms of PTSD. It is a symptom of experiencing trauma. And so if you have someone that's numbed out and experiencing depression, they might not really characterize what they're experiencing as stress. And so I don't think it's like accurate in every case to think of the effects of trauma as stress. They might show up slightly differently. And what's important is that we treat the underlying cause of the issues as opposed to just treating a symptom the same way regardless of what the underlying issue is. In some cases, depression is going to be a symptom of moral injury. In other cases, it might be something different. And so it's important to identify where the symptoms are coming from. So towards that end, the third thing that I want to talk about is when I use the term PTSD, I'm using the term post-traumatic suffering disorder. And this is a term I made up, and I don't have any authority, so we'll see if anyone cares. But the reason that I did that is for what I just talked about, basically, because it's more accurate. Everyone that's experiencing the symptoms of trauma is going to be suffering. Not everyone is going to characterize it as stress. And so what's cool about this little shift is that we can keep saying PTSD because the acronym stays the same, post-traumatic suffering disorder, right? But just know that when I'm saying it, I'm talking about post-traumatic suffering disorder, not post-traumatic stress disorder, unless I'm specifically referencing like the diagnosis from the DSM or something. And so you might say, well, what's the difference? Say, really nothing. Because the way that most people use the term PTSD is to point to the collection of things that goes wrong with a person as a result of experiencing trauma. And that's how we all use the word. And so, or that term, right? PTSD, that acronym. And we can all keep using it the same way, because that's how I think of it. And so I created my own model for PTSD. I call it the 3PA, or the 3 problem area model. And I have a video about that. And then a second video going through all the DSM criteria and explaining how each one of those is a downstream symptom of basically those 3 core problem areas. And so I'm not going to go over that again in this video because I already covered that in the other videos. But I just wanted to briefly touch on that. The other thing that I'm trying to do with this is to create a community of people that are suffering from the symptoms of trauma and are collectively working together to figure out how to fix them. And so that's what the goal is with the subreddit. Because if we have a whole bunch of people that are trying to use meditation and yoga and EMDR and some of these other tools and techniques for getting a nervous system back under control and getting and healing your central nervous system and getting it so you're not living in your fight or flight response, it would be useful if we had a community of people that were all doing the same thing and were communicating with each other about what was working and what wasn't. And so that's the goal with the subreddit, is I want to build a community of people that are all basically working towards the same goal. So you think about like something like bodybuilding, right? Like if you go far enough back in time, and I'm not familiar enough to know exactly what period that was, it might be the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, but there's not going to be a lot of like scientific data on what the best like number of like sets and repetitions for growing muscle would be. And so what basically bodybuilders did was they all tried different things and then they communicated with each other about what was working, right? And the thing is, we don't want to do that with something that there's a potential people could hurt themselves, right? So with any healing endeavor, first, do no harm, right? The old saying applies. But when we're talking about things like meditation and yoga and like, approved therapies and recognized treatments that are being administered by professionals, like as long as we go about this intelligently, I consider it like a golden opportunity for us to like collaborate and basically crowdsource learning and understanding. And then any researchers, academics, or professionals are, eagerly invited to join our community. Because if you're a researcher and you're trying to figure out like, well, I want to design a study for meditation. Well, how useful would it be to have like a whole bunch of like Reddit posts where people are talking about different kinds of meditation they tried and what worked and what didn't? You can use all of that to help inform the way that you're going to design your studies, right? And so I'm hoping that this community can be a resource for the researchers, right? And so that's what I'm hoping to do with the community. And then also it's going to be a resource for people. So somewhere like if you have questions, if you're, confused about something, you can go and you can post there. And initially I'm going to be very active with it at first. I kind of think at some point I'm going to answer a lot of the questions, and I'll still have an active role, but I'll be maybe less active. We'll see how that plays out. The goal here is just to make everything as useful as possible to people, to basically help as many people that have experienced trauma as possible. That's the goal. So, and the way I got started on all this, I had a lot of awful things happen to me when I was a kid. And then I deployed to Afghanistan twice with an infantry platoon. And by the time I got out of the Army in 2010, I had pretty much every symptom of PTSD. I didn't realize I was having flashbacks because I was having a more milder version of them. And they went away after the first. I don't really remember exactly how long. I do vividly remember having them for the first few months though. But despite the fact that I was suffering tremendously, I didn't actually get into therapy until 2017. I was in total denial that I had PTSD. I was in denial that I had like mental health issues. And basically during that time, I was struggling with severe depression. I was, considering suicide pretty frequently. Honestly, there were probably a few points I probably would have did it if I didn't have kids, but that was always kind of like a really good reason not to do it because I just couldn't bring myself to do that to them. So, I had a dysregulated nervous system, and that really messed with me in a lot of ways I didn't even really realize at the time, because I was also experiencing a lot of numbness. I had alexithymia, so I wasn't recognizing that my nervous system was active. So it was really more like I just felt really like amped up, but I couldn't quite put my finger on like what was going on because I was so out of touch with my body. I also had, one of the biggest things was I struggled with relationships, like with my, romantic relationships. Well, I was married at the time. So with my marriage, it affected my marriage. But the biggest thing really was it affected the way I interact with my kids, because kids are like happy and carefree and joyful. And I had little kids, back then. And so I really I had such a hard time just like playing with them, because when you're really struggling with, all the symptoms of PTSD, it's like you are just not at all on the same wavelength as little kids that are playing and having fun. Like playing and having fun that's not what you do, right? It's like whatever the opposite of playing and having fun is. That's what you do when you have PTSD, right? And so I just had such a hard time like really being present and really connecting with my kids, and in some ways like even like having like a close relationship with them was difficult. And that really bothered me because it was something that was really important to me and something that I tried, but it was like there were these issues that were keeping me from doing it. A lot of issues with sleep. And a lot of it I just characterized as I was carrying around like a tremendous amount of pain. And so I was just hurting like a lot, like really, really a lot, but like at such a deep level. And it was something that I'd always carried around. And so it was almost like I'd just gotten used to it as part of my existence. And it wasn't until I started to really recognize it and deal with it that I realized just how much I'd been carrying around. I got into therapy in 2017 and that helped a lot. But in 2019, when my marriage finally fell apart, I looked at my life and I realized that like if I didn't like really, really heal myself, I was never going to be happy, because I was never going to have the relationships that I wanted. And I was also, I had realized at this point that no matter what I did, even if I won the lottery and I was dating supermodels and I had everything in my life that I wanted, I still was going to be miserable because I was suffering as a result of experiencing all the trauma that I had. And the only thing that was going to get that suffering to go away was to heal. And so in the spring of 2019, I said, this is like my mission in life now. I'm going to fix myself. Still had a job, still, was a dad, but like the same way that people are like, okay, I'm going to do an Ironman triathlon, right? And they start training for it and they kind of like reprioritize their life where it's like, they're exercising every day and their diet has to completely change and like all this, right? They rearrange their life, making that a priority. That's like the level of commitment that I had with like healing. And so I got on the internet and I looked around, and honestly, like I couldn't find any good information about what I was supposed to be doing. Like, it's like basically there were resources that explained like this, like what symptoms of PTSD were, but they didn't really explain like why you were having the symptoms or where they were coming from or how to fix them at all. And so it was really just like information about figuring out that would help someone understand if they were experiencing the symptoms of trauma. And it's like, okay, I already figured that out. Like I now know that I am, yes, in fact, experiencing the symptoms of trauma. What do I do with it? What do I do? And there just really wasn't any good resources back then. And there still like really isn't. And that's the goal of this. This is that resource that I'm trying to create, the resource that I wish I'd had back in 2019 when I decided to heal. That's what I'm trying to create with this. And so my initial plan was I was going to use psychology. Obviously, that would make sense. But I was also decided that philosophy was going to play a central role in the healing process. And part of the reason that one of the main reasons I did that was because when I first got into therapy back in 2017, I was recommended a little book called Happiness is an Inside Job. And it's an introduction to mindfulness. It's also kind of an introduction to like some of the basic ideas of Buddhism. And it's not a religious book at all. It's not even really like a philosophical book. It's kind of a philosophy book, but it's really just teaches a person mindfulness and teaches a person that the way that you use your thoughts is really like really affects your experience. And that book changed my life because it made me realize that the way that I was using my attention and the story that I was telling myself and the way that I was choosing to look at things really like impacted my experience. And so I had gotten a taste of how valuable and how useful philosophy could be. And then in June of 2019, I finished reading, or I read the book, How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, which talks about the history of psychedelics, like back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, how they were used, how that when they were legal, they were widely used in clinical settings to treat all kinds of mental health disorders. And so after I got done reading that book, I was like, holy shit, like I guess I need to add psychedelics to the list, right? So now psychology, philosophy, and psychedelics. And like not long after that, I happened to be offered some chocolate with psilocybin in it, and I ate it, and it was amazing. I had probably ingested like a half a gram, let's say, but the effects that it had on me, it lifted me out of my depression in a way that I didn't even realize like how depressed I was until I started kind of coming out of it, until that first experience lifted me out of it. And it really kind of shifted the way that I saw a lot of things. And it made me realize like, wow, like these are really, this is a powerful tool, right? Unfortunately, that my depression, I went from like being like pretty depressed to like not depressed, but then over like a month or so, like it gradually shifted back down. And that was kind of the pattern. And it took me a while to figure out like what was going on with that. And I realized that it comes down to like basically habits and thinking and perceiving and feeling, and neurons that fire together, wire together. And so I had these like pathways of thinking and feeling that were basically like feeding my depression. And so it took like a few years really to figure that out, and to figure out how to use psychedelics, like to basically make a shift. And then you use mindfulness to maintain that shift afterwards, because it's like you've jumped out of a rut, right? But the tire is going to want to slide back into the rut because it's so well worn. And so you've got to keep effort to keep your mind from going back to those old ways of thinking and perceiving and feeling. And I'll talk more about all that later, but so I started incorporating psychedelics into the healing process pretty early on. That first year, I only had, I think, 4 experiences with psilocybin, and they were all under 2 grams. So they were all pretty low doses. And then, it was, that first year was pretty chaotic because I was going through my divorce. And then New Year's Eve of 2019, I got a call from my sister letting me know that our mom had 2 weeks left to live. I didn't have really a close relationship with her. She was the source of quite a bit of my trauma. So, but I wanted to reconcile things before she died. So I went back, and she ended up hanging out for another 2 months. And so I was taking care of her, and then I'm back and forth, also like with my work and with my kids and everything. But I spent most of like that 2 months in Wisconsin taking care of her. And so that really kind of opened up a whole bunch of like, kind of started opening up repressed memories. So like I started having these dreams, and like in one dream, I was like in this picturesque little town that was like by a river, but there was like some kind of evil that was like lurking up in the hills behind the town, right? So that was the first dream. And then I had another dream where I was in some kind of container facility, and I was being chased, and I had to get out, or if I was found, I was going to die or something like that. And then in the third dream, I was in a car with like some other people. I don't know. I couldn't see their face. I didn't know who they were, but we were driving on this road, like a highway. And on the right, it was just like a wall of fog. And on the left, it was like a clear view. And I like knew in the dream that I was like, had just left that container facility, which I think basically represented my unconscious mind, where all these memories were being stored. And we were driving on this road, and I kind of just like, in the dream, like I was driving and we slowed to a stop on the road, and it was like time to stop and like fight it out, like, no more running basically. And so that was really interesting. And right after that, COVID started, and so that's when I really like kind of became a hermit. And August of that year, I had my first experience with MDMA. That was also unplanned, and that was life-changing. I mean, that was so transformative. I'll talk more about MDMA and psilocybin and how I use those drugs in a different video. I'm just trying to tell a story right now of kind of how I got here. And it was after that, in the fall of 2020, that I really started experimenting with higher doses of psilocybin in the 5 gram plus range. And that was, it was a lot of trying to figure out what I was doing, trying to figure out how to use those experiences to heal. Luckily, psilocybin is very much like inclined to almost like want to do that for you, basically. And so it didn't, it wasn't that hard. It kind of like, you just have to know kind of how to play along, and I'll make another video about that. But you have to know how to use the experiences to heal, right? And as I was going along, I was like just basically trying to figure stuff out. Like, what is really going on with me? Like, where is all my suffering coming from? How do I fix these problems, right? And I at one point realized I decided I was going to try to use meditation to bring my nervous system into balance. So I realized that my fight or flight response was like kind of stuck in the on position because I was starting to heal my alexithymia. So I was starting to get the sensations in my body back, which was almost like now worse, because whereas before my body was like going into fight or flight and I was like experiencing panic, but I wasn't feeling it. Now I was feeling everything. And so it was almost like worse in a way because I was starting to get those sensations back. But that was part of the process of getting things regulated, I realized, because I had to be able to feel what was going on, so I could tell how, when I needed to try to bring it back to baseline. So that was a process. Over the course of like 4 or 5 months, I did a lot of work with meditation and mindfulness, and I was really able to get my nervous system kind of balanced out. It took a few more years after that to like really get to a point where I'm like, oh wow, like I'm really like my digestion's really healthy. I'm sleeping through the night. I feel really peaceful. I feel really calm. But so that was a process. And so I just had all these experiences along the way, where like I'd figure this thing out or I'd figure that thing out. And I was kind of looking through all these different resources, just trying to find answers, like listening to Jordan Peterson lectures and Alan Watts lectures and reading, various books and using the psychedelic experience as a window to understanding my trauma and the effects of trauma and myself. And eventually the whole thing kind of turned into like a shamanic journey, more like the hero's journey, if you're familiar with like Joseph Campbell's work and Carl Jung and all that. And really it almost kind of became more about like what I would call psychological growth and transformation at that point, like what Carl Jung called individuation. And this is a psychological process that's available to everyone. It's just a matter of if you want to engage with it consciously. And it's been called different things. So like Maslow, the guy with the hierarchy of needs, he called it self-actualization. Carl Jung called it individuation. Robert Keegan has a model for it that has 5 stages, although I think his idea is that you go through the stages as kind of a natural progression through life. And my conclusion was you can actually actively participate in that process in order to accelerate it. So you can actually go to stage 5 consciousness, like I'm at stage 5 consciousness right now, and I'm only in my 30s. And that's because I did all this work, right? And then Ken Wilber has like a 10-stage model for the development of consciousness. And so this is a process that you can engage with. And it really at that point kind of became about that just as much as it was about healing. And then I was also trying to make sense of evil because I had realized that I needed to heal my relationship with reality. And in order to do that, I had to make sense of evil. And so I was I was basically just like an investigator, like, trying to figure stuff out. Right. And so like one night I was sitting and I was reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and I came across this passage, and I talk about it in one of the other videos, but I came across this passage, and this is at a point where I was really thinking like, wow, like I really don't trust reality. Like I'm really just waiting for like reality to bitch slap me. And like, I realized that was like a big source of my suffering for a variety of reasons, but which I'll get into in a different video. But I read that passage and I was like, holy shit, like this is one of the core issues of PTSD. Like these 3 relationships. And I thought of it as, I simplified it to the relationship with self, the relationship that you have with humanity and people, because it exists at different levels. And then the relationship that you have with reality/God, depending on how you want to think of that. Because even if you're an atheist, you still have a relationship with reality. And I was so excited about this because I'm like, I figured something out. Like, this is it. This is one of the issues. And the more I thought about it, like that whole weekend, right? I was like, wow, like this, yes. And then I was so excited to tell my therapist that week. And she's like, oh yeah, that's moral injury. Like, yeah, we know about that. I'm like, oh. But that was cool because I was like on the right track, right? So I was like, okay, cool. So it was stuff like that. Like, and so eventually I kind of started half jokingly calling myself a psychedelic detective because I didn't know what else, because I was taking all this so seriously that like, I almost kind of felt like I had to give myself some kind of a label, because we tend to do that because we want to like craft our identity, so we like to label ourselves with different things. And now I'm not as concerned with that because, like authenticity is a big part of psychological growth and transformation. And so, authenticity, the more authentic you are, the less you worry about labels and all that, right? But back then, like, I was like, I still do need to call myself something, right? Because they're gonna be like, well, am I a philosopher? Am I a psychologist? No, I'm not a scientist, right? I'm not a shaman because I don't come from like an indigenous culture and I don't come from like a shamanic tradition, and I'm not, and so like, what am I really? And so I was like, I'm a psychedelic detective because I'm, using psychedelics to investigate myself, and I'm using psychedelics to investigate consciousness, and I'm using psychedelics to investigate the psychedelic experience to figure out how to use it, right, for healing trauma, and I'm using the psychedelic experience to figure out how to heal trauma, right? So I'm an investigator of sorts. And so I started kind of half jokingly calling myself a psychedelic detective, and then as it went along, I was like, well, I guess that's what I am, because like I said, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a shaman, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a psychologist, but I am kind of all those things at the same time, right? And one of the things that I like worried about with introducing all these ideas to people was that I'm not a scientist. I don't have a PhD after my name. I didn't go to school for this stuff. But here's the thing, and this is something I just realized in the last couple of weeks. although it wasn't like the final thing that got me to do this. It just kind of worked out. But I realized that, you know, healing moral injury really is like those 3 relationships with self, people, and reality. That's actually like a really good way of thinking about spiritual health, right? Because what you have to do is you have to take those relationships from being like really shitty and damaged, and you have to turn them into something transcendent. And that's spiritual health, man. And the thing is, science doesn't recognize spirit. And so how can you heal something you don't recognize? And so it was never going to be scientists that figured out how to heal moral injury. It's more the realm of like priests and shamans and stuff, right? But it probably would be smart if you also incorporated some psychology and maybe some other stuff. And that's kind of what I did. And so it's like, maybe it had to be a psychedelic detective that figured all this out. That's kind of how I see it now, because it just crosses so many different areas of expertise and areas of knowledge. And so I don't know, I guess I'm a psychedelic detective, and that's weird, but I put it on my LinkedIn. Check this out. How cool is that? Right? So I'm putting on my business cards. So I haven't got the business cards made, but that'll be fun. But you know, I don't know. I hope I can make these videos, and I hope I can share, you know, what I've learned with people in a way that's useful and that helps people heal. I'm going to keep making these videos until I say everything I have to say about this. Until, you know, if people are still asking questions, I'll keep making videos. But hopefully you guys find all this useful and interesting. And thanks for watching.